This case is focused on the faulty ignition switches General Motors, the Detroit-based automaker, had incorporated into their vehicles during the mid-2000s. General Motors had decided to incorporate a new ignition switch for the 2003 line of cars. Ray DiGiorgio, a GM engineer, had approved production of faulty ignition switches. The switches were flawed because it had been unable to provide enough mechanical resistance to heavy keyrings. This could shut off the engine during driving, which will turn off power steering and prevent airbag inflation in case of an accident. This affected over 2.5 million vehicles produced by GM and is linked to 124 deaths and 275 injuries. DiGiorgio had known the switches did not meet GM standards and still approved them. GM knew of the issue but decided acting on a solution because it was not considered an acceptable business case. In 2006, amid reports of GM cars stalling, DiGiorgio approved a new design that fixed the ignition switch. However, the serial number had stayed the same. This had thrown investigators off track. After the public had been made aware of the scandal, changes were made at GM to prevent this from occurring again. Reparations exceeding $2.5 billion were paid out. The ethical issues of this case will be looked at two perspectives, DiGiorgio and the engineer as well as GM. I will follow the guidelines set up by PEO. DiGiorgio had incorporated a substandard ignition switch into GM cars. This violates 72.2b since he had knowingly put a faulty part into vehicles that can lead to injury, as well as 72.2d since the ignition switch had not met the standards at GM. The other engineers at GM had failed to report the issue and are in violation of 72.2c since they failed to correct the situation. Both parties are guilty of violating 77.2i because public welfare was significantly compromised with defective GM cars on the road.
Additionally, DiGiorgio also approved of a new model for the switch without reporting it. When he had been questioned by investigators regarding the change, he claimed that he didn't recall. This violates 72.2i, the failure to supply documents or information when requested by an investigator, and 77.1i, to act with fairness and loyalty to his employer. To deal with these issues, we have three possible solutions: to whistleblow to the PEO, to put unified emphasis on the issue and persist on action, or to stop the manufacturer from directly producing the switches. Whistleblowing to the PEO would keep public welfare in mind and is ethically correct, but this could be detrimental to the engineers and DiGiorgio, as they may lose their job and they may be showing disloyalty to their employer. Putting a unified emphasis on the issue and persisting on action with the management would consider public safety, be fair to the employer, and grouping up with engineers and workers would show the severity of the situation, but it may not be effective as management may need more convincing. Stopping the manufacturer from directly producing the switches does not actually deal with the issue of current vehicles having the faulty switches, and it is also in bad faith to your employer as you are not reporting what you are doing to them. The best decision that could be made based on the given solutions would be to unify the engineers and other employees to pressure management into recalling the vehicles. This option would be fair to the employers, it would allow them to keep public safety in mind and be open about the issue. However, it must stay internal. And if this does not work, then the engineer should go to the PEO. Now, looking at it from the perspective of GM management, it is clear that they did not show concern for public welfare when they decided not to act when they found out about the issue, and some members of the management even claimed that they did not know about the ignition switch problem. This violates 72.2a, negligence, 72.2b, the failure to make provisions for safeguarding of life, and 77.2i, the duty to public welfare. We have three possible solutions to fix the issues. First, we could recall the cars, which would be the most expensive and most logical solution, and it would consider public welfare. Next, we have the firing of the engineers that caused the issue in the first place, but it wouldn't deal with the issue with cars having the switch already, and thus would be a knee-jerk reaction and a bad decision. Finally, we have the halting of more cars with the switches. This would be a good preventative measure, but it does not deal with the issue at hand. The best decision for GM to make would be to recall the cars and absorb the cost of repairing them, showing the public that they care about their welfare, and in the future, they should apply preventative measures allowing for more time for testing.
If the General Motors case was tried under Canadian law, the law that would be broken would be tort law. What is tort law? Tort law is a law that addresses an issue where the defendant owes a duty of care to the plaintiff or breaks his duty of care, and that there does not need to be a contractual relationship between the defendant and the plaintiff. There are three conditions to meeting tort law. The first condition is that the defendant owed a duty of care to the plaintiff. The second condition was that there was a failure in fulfilling his duty of care. And the third condition was that the plaintiff suffered losses and or damages because of this failure. The precedents that are relevant to the General Motors case are Donahue v. Stevenson and Winnipeg Condos v. Burr Construction. Who are the defendant and plaintiffs in this case? The defendant is General Motors. The plaintiffs are the government, victims, and their families. To check if General Motors have met the three conditions of tort law, first, did General Motors have a duty of care to the public? Yes, because they are responsible to the public with their vehicles. 2. Have General Motors failed in that duty of care? Yes, because they allowed faulty ignition switches on their vehicles and they sold it to the public. 3. Have victims suffered damages and or losses due to the failure of duty of care? Yes, because many have suffered physical and emotional pain as well as death. The liabilities and damages that General Motors will have to face are general, punitive, consequential, and aggravated damages. Decision. So a court will most likely find the defendant, General Motors, guilty of all charges because tort law was violated and that General Motors had failed in their duty of care to the public. To conclude this presentation, this case serves as a great reminder that engineers must be ethical and lawful when conducting their work, and the engineering work has to be upheld to the highest standards by society.